speakers, plural. Either one will do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My call on this bill will be reasonably brief. As the previous speaker mentioned, there is good support for these bills from this side of the House, from Labor at least. That's not to say that we didn't apply significant scrutiny to both bills, because we are essentially debating two quite separate orders this afternoon. I want to begin with the public safety, public protection orders. Now, this bill was first promised by Judith Collins and John Key back in 2011. It would have been, I think, useful and aided the passage of this significant piece of legislation had opposition parties been engaged at that time in the passage of that bill. That didn't happen. That was disappointing. I would like to, though, thank the Minister for Corrections, both Anne Tolley and Sam Lotoinga, who took a different approach for the second bill we'll debate. But for public safety, public protection orders, that did not happen. And that was disappointing, because these are significant changes that we are debating. As has been outlined by Phil Goff, we have a spectrum of orders which allow flexibility in terms of dealing with prisoners who are at risk, a significant risk of reoffending, and have already demonstrated that the areas in which they offend are of a particularly grievous nature. So child sex offenders, serious violent offenders, and the like. If you look at the spectrum of options available, at sentencing, of course, you have the ability to apply an indeterminate sentence via preventive detention. And what that intends to do is very much in the name, giving the flexibility of the parole board in the future to make an assessment that a particular offender is simply still at too high a risk to release back into the community, and basing that judgment on the Parole Act, which deems that you must always make an assessment as to the risk to the community. That assumes that at the time of sentencing, the judge has enough information to determine that risk. It became apparent to Phil Goff, as Minister of Justice, that there were offenders who were about to be released back into the community who, had perhaps the judge had the appropriate information at the time of sentencing, may have considered them an appropriate candidate for preventive detention, but did not. And what do you do in that scenario? And that is a significant and very real concern which Phil Goff faced. There was a particular prisoner at that time, I believe, who was about to be released, who he had to consider how the justice system would deal with that known risk. And out of that came extended supervision orders. So a 10-year order. It was very narrowly framed. It was for child sex offenders. It expired after 10 years. So that was the spectrum of orders available to enable us to assess risk and to act accordingly. But what if someone who is coming up for an extended supervision order actually needed more than just monitoring in the community? There was a need for there to be the ability to not even allow them back into the community. There was no real option there, and so I can see why the government looked at the public protection orders. They cannot be used as punishment, though. That is a step too far outside the realms of our justice system to try and relitigate a sentence a finite sentence that is being ordered by a judge in the judiciary. We also need to ensure that when these orders are used, that there are appropriate checks and balances. I think the Select Committee made some good recommendations, but those annual checks against to ensure that those orders are still being applied appropriately, given it's a civil, not a criminal regime, given it is not a extended punishment, but a form of protection, is incredibly important. I want to implore Parliament to continue to take a role in oversight over these orders. They are significant. They extend well beyond where our justice system has gone before, and although we support them, we're very, very committed to making sure that they are only ever used in the appropriate circumstances, and that the magnitude of risk justifies the use of the orders. We then come to the parole extended supervision orders. These are not residential orders. They are supervision within the community orders. These, in one sense, even though they were considered a greater breach against the Bill of Rights than the public protection orders, actually are at a lower level because they allow monitoring within the community. This is an extension of what Labor already had brought in, an extension in terms of who is eligible for those orders and removing the 10-year time lapse on them. Again, I would implore this Parliament to maintain oversight of these orders to ensure they are appropriately used, because they are taking us well beyond where our previous conventions have taken us. Internationally, they're not used widely either. So, Mr. Speaker, we do accept the need for these orders. We do accept the need for flexibility to manage serious offenders who continue to pose a risk to the community, but we also ask that we take our role very seriously in ensuring their appropriate use and their frugal use.